Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. Once upon a time, in a gloomy little town shrouded in mystery, there stood a quaint old bookshop. Its creaky wooden sign swayed gently in the chilly wind, announcing, "Victor's Book Emporium." To any curious passerby, the narrow cobblestone streets, dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, cast eerie shadows on the damp walls of the surrounding buildings, adding to the town's enigmatic charm. In this peculiar town lived Victor, the middle-aged owner of the bookshop. He was known for his extensive collection of rare and unusual books, which attracted scholars and bibliophiles from far and wide. However, as of late, the townspeople couldn't help but notice a change in Victor's demeanor. Once a kind and gentle soul, he had become increasingly irritable and withdrawn. Rumors swirled around the town about the cause of his transformation, but no one knew the real reason behind it. One foggy evening, as Victor was closing up the bookshop, his old friend Thomas stopped by to check on him.
"Victor, my friend,"
Thomas said with a concerned frown.
"I've noticed you've been acting rather strange lately. Is everything all right?"
Victor sighed, avoiding eye contact.
I appreciate your concern, Thomas, but I'm fine. I just have a lot on my mind, that's all.
Thomas hesitated, sensing there was more to the story.
"You know, Victor, back in the day, you used to be the kindest person I knew. You'd always lend a helping hand to anyone in need, and you were especially fond of animals. Remember Midnight, your beloved black cat? Whatever happened to him?"
At the mention of Midnight, Victor's eyes grew wide, and his hands trembled ever so slightly.
That's a painful memory, Thomas.
He whispered, swallowing hard.
Let's not talk about it.
As Victor turned away, a gust of wind blew through the street, carrying a soft, ghostly meow that seemed to echo in the night. Both men shuddered, but neither of them could pinpoint where the sound had come from. Unbeknownst to them, the shadows of the past were about to come alive, setting the stage for a chilling tale of guilt, redemption, and the haunting power of a cat's vengeful spirit. And so, the story of the phantom feline began. Chapter 2. The Phantom Feline. The days that followed were filled with an unshakable sense of unease. Victor couldn't help but feel as if he were being watched, and every shadow seemed to hide an unseen presence. One stormy afternoon, as he was returning from a visit to the market, Victor stumbled upon a small, shivering black cat huddled in an alleyway. The sight of the cat sent a chill down his spine, for it bore a striking resemblance to Midnight, his long-lost pet. As Victor approached the cat, it gazed at him with piercing yellow eyes, never blinking, never looking away. Victor felt a pang of guilt in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He hesitated for a moment before deciding to bring the cat back to his bookshop, providing it with shelter from the storm. Little did he know that he had just invited the phantom feline into his life. From that day on, the black cat never left Victor's side. It followed him around the bookshop, always lurking in the corners of his vision. Victor found himself growing more and more unnerved by its presence, unable to shake the feeling that the cat knew his darkest secrets. Each day, the phantom feline seemed to grow bolder, its ghostly meows echoing through the empty halls of the bookshop, taunting Victor with memories of his past. As Victor's encounters with the cat became increasingly distressing, the townspeople took notice of his erratic behavior. Whispers began to spread, and some started to question Victor's sanity. In the local tavern, Thomas and his friend, Martha, discussed their concerns.
"Have you seen Victor lately, Thomas?"
Martha asked, her voice tinged with worry.
"He's been acting so strange, always muttering to himself and looking over his shoulder. And what's with that black cat that's always with him?"
Thomas shook his head, his brow furrowed.
"I don't know, Martha. It's like he's being hunted by something, or someone. That cat. It's almost as if it's a ghost, sent to torment him."
As the townspeople whispered and speculated, Victor's desperation grew. He knew he had to rid himself of the ghostly cat, but how? With each passing day, The phantom feline tightened its grip on Victor's conscience, pulling him deeper into the shadows of his own guilt. And in those shadows, the whispers in the dark grew louder, revealing the true extent of Victor's past actions and the reasons behind his cruelty. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. As Victor's torment continued, the townspeople grew increasingly concerned. One evening, a small group of them gathered in the dimly lit corner of the local tavern, determined to uncover the truth behind Victor's odd behavior. Among them were Thomas, Martha, and an elderly woman named Edna, who had known Victor since he was a child.
Victor used to be such a kind and gentle soul.
Edna began, her voice quivering with emotion.
He'd always help anyone in need, and he had a special love for animals. I remember when he adopted Midnight, his old black cat, and how much he cared for her. But something changed in him after she passed away. It's as if his heart turned cold.
Thomas chimed in, recalling a rumor he had heard.
I heard that Victor did something terrible to another animal after Midnight died. Some say it was out of grief. Others believe it was an act of cruelty. Whatever it was, it seems to have haunted him ever since.
The others nodded solemnly, understanding that Victor's recent actions were a result of the guilt that weighed heavily on his conscience. As they continued to discuss his strange behavior, Victor himself was pacing the floor of his bookshop, wringing his hands and muttering under his breath.
I can't take it anymore,
he whispered to himself, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape from the ghostly cat.
This phantom feline is driving me mad. I must find a way to be rid of it once and for all.
Victor's desperation was mounting, and he knew he needed to confide in someone. Late one night, he sought out Edna, the only person in town who still seemed to care for him. Trembling, he spilled his darkest secrets, revealing the cruelty he had committed and the guilt that had consumed him ever since. Edna listened with a mixture of sadness and shock.
Victor, my dear boy,
she said softly.
You must confront your past and accept the consequences of your actions. Only then can you find redemption and be free from this haunting.
With Edna's wise words echoing in his mind, Victor made a decision. It was time to face the phantom feline and confront the specter of his past. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and heartache, but he could no longer hide from the whispers in the dark. Chapter 4. Confronting the Specter. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared himself to confront the ghostly cat. With a newfound determination, he set out into the night, following the shadowy figure that seemed to be taunting him from the corner of his eye. As he walked through the dark, narrow streets of the gloomy town, the wind howled around him, heightening his sense of unease.
Show yourself,
Victor shouted into the darkness, trying to mask the fear in his voice.
I am ready to face you and my past.
The black cat appeared before him, its eyes glinting like embers in the night. It beckoned him with a flick of its tail, leading him on a harrowing journey through the town. Victor followed the cat through a series of increasingly eerie and unsettling locations: an abandoned house with creaking floorboards, a graveyard shrouded in fog, and a derelict church where the wind whistled through the broken windows, creating an otherworldly melody. At each stop, the cat forced Victor to confront his guilt, presenting him with vivid reminders of his past actions. Victor saw a vision of himself hurting the animal that had triggered his descent into darkness, and he felt the weight of his guilt bearing down on him like a suffocating blanket. As they reached the final stop on their journey, the very spot where Victor had buried Midnight, the ghostly cat stopped and stared at him, its eyes burning into his soul. Victor could no longer hold back the tears.
I'm so sorry,
he sobbed, falling to his knees.
I know what I did was wrong, and I can't change the past. But I beg you, please, forgive me. Let me make amends.
The cat studied him for a moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. Then, with a flick of its tail, it vanished into the darkness. Victor felt a great weight lifted from his shoulders, and he knew that he had been granted a chance at redemption. As he walked back through the town, The eerie atmosphere seemed to dissipate, as if the specter of his guilt had been exorcised. Victor was filled with hope, determined to face the consequences of his actions and make amends for his past cruelty. Chapter 5. The Road to Redemption. Victor woke up the next morning, feeling lighter and more determined than ever to make amends for his past cruelty. He started by cleaning up his bookshop, sweeping away the dust and cobwebs that had accumulated during his descent into darkness. As he worked, he could feel the energy in the shop shifting, becoming warmer and more inviting. Victor then reached out to the townspeople, making a conscious effort to reconnect with them. He offered to help repair the broken fence at Mrs. Brown's house and volunteered at the local soup kitchen, serving meals to those in need. At first, the townspeople were wary of his sudden change, but as they saw Victor's genuine efforts, they slowly started to accept him again. One day, as Victor was organizing books in his shop, a young girl named Emily timidly approached him. She had heard from her friends that the once cruel bookshop owner was turning over a new leaf and had decided to see for herself.
"Excuse me, Mr. Victor?"
Emily asked hesitantly.
"I was wondering if you had any books about cats. My family just adopted a kitten, and I'd like to learn how to take care of her."
Victor smiled warmly and led Emily to a shelf filled with books on animals. As they browsed the titles together, he found himself sharing stories of his beloved Midnight with the young girl, his heart swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed, Victor continued to work on rebuilding his relationships with the townspeople and making amends for his past actions. He started a book club at his shop, creating a space where people could come together, share their love of reading, and learn from one another. His once dreary bookshop became a lively hub of community activity, as people of all ages gathered to exchange ideas and stories. As Victor stood in the doorway of his bustling shop one day, he realized that he had found inner peace and a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. The ghostly cat had been a catalyst for change, forcing him to confront his guilt and seek redemption. Now, free from the torment of his past, Victor was ready to embrace the future and continue on the road to redemption. The townspeople, witnessing Victor's transformation, were reminded of the power of forgiveness and the importance of compassion. Slowly, the gloomy atmosphere that had once shrouded the town began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. Victor's journey to redemption had not only transformed his life but also inspired those around him to believe in the power of change and the possibility of a brighter future. Epilogue: A New Dawn. Months had passed since Victor's redemption, and the once gloomy town had transformed into a place full of warmth and hope. Victor's bookshop continued to be a bustling hub of activity, where townspeople gathered to share their love of reading and form lasting friendships. One sunny afternoon, Emily, the young girl who had helped Victor on his journey, was sitting in the bookshop with her friends discussing their latest book club pick.
"Victor's story is amazing, isn't it?"
Emily said to her friends.
"Who would have thought that a ghostly cat could bring about such a change in him and the whole town?"
Her friend, Jacob, nodded.
"It just goes to show everyone deserves a second chance, and sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you."
As the children continued their discussion, Victor watched them from behind the counter, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew that his transformation had not only changed his life but also had a lasting impact on the town and its inhabitants. The spirit of kindness and forgiveness had spread throughout the community, inspiring others to confront their own guilt and seek redemption. One day, as Victor was watering the flowers outside his shop, Mrs. Brown, the elderly neighbor he had helped earlier, approached him.
"Victor,
She said with a gentle smile.
I just wanted to thank you for all you've done for our town. You've brought us together, and your bookshop has become a place where we can learn, grow, and find solace."
Victor smiled back at her, touched by her words.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. It was the support of people like you who helped me find my way. We've all played a part in making this town a better place.
As the sun set on the town, casting a warm glow on the streets and buildings, Victor stood in the doorway of his bookshop, reflecting on his journey. He knew that he could never undo the mistakes of his past, but he had found redemption and purpose in his new life. And as the townspeople continued to heal and grow, they too were reminded of the power of hope, the importance of forgiveness, and the possibility of a brighter future. Together, they had created a new dawn for themselves and the generations to come.
Chapter 1. My story begins. In 1825, I was 10 years old. My father and mother were dead. I lived with my aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Reed. Their house was called Gateshead Hall. The house was in Yorkshire, in the north of England. My aunt and Uncle Reed had 2 children, a boy, John, and a girl, Eliza. I liked my Uncle Reed and he liked me. But in 1825, my uncle died. After that, I was very unhappy. My Aunt Reed did not like me. And John and Eliza were unkind to me. It was a cold, rainy day in December. All of us were in the house. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to read. I opened a book. Then I heard my cousin John's voice.
Jane! Jane Eyre! Where are you?
John shouted. He came into the room and he saw me.
Why are you reading my book?
He asked.
Give it to me.
John took the book. He hit my head with it. I screamed. John hit me again. I pulled his hair and I kicked him.
Help! Help, Mama!
John shouted.
Jane Eyre is hurting me.
Aunt Reed ran into the room. She pulled me away from John.
John hit me with the book.
I said.
I hate him, and I hate you too.
You are a bad girl, Jane.
My aunt said.
Why do you hate me? You don't like me?
I replied.
John and Eliza were unkind to me. I want to leave Gateshead Hall.
You want to leave?
Aunt Reed said.
Where will you go? Your parents are dead. You cannot live alone.
Aunt Reed thought for a moment.
My friend, Mr. Brocklehurst, is the owner of a school,
she said.
I will send you to Mr. Brocklehurst's school.
A few days later, Mr. Brocklehurst came to Gateshead Hall. He was a very tall man. His eyes were dark and his face was cruel.
Jane Eyre,
he said to me.
God does not like bad children. God punishes bad children. Jane Eyre, God will punish John Reed.
I replied.
John Reed is man. He shouts at me.
That is not true. You are a liar, Jane Eyre.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
You must not tell lies. And you must not live here with your cousins. You will come to Lowood School. You will become a good girl.
I want to come to your school, sir.
I said.
I want to leave this house.
Bad girls are punished at my school, Jane Eyre.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
The girls work very hard at Lowood.
I will work hard. I will be a good pupil, Mr. Brocklehurst.
I said. 2 weeks later, I left Gateshead Hall. I went to Lowood School. Chapter 2, Lowood School. It was the month of January. I arrived at Lowood School at night. A servant took me up some stairs and into a big bedroom. There were many beds in the room. The girls in the beds were asleep. The servant took me to an empty bed. I put on my night clothes and I got into bed. Soon, I was asleep too. I woke up very early. A loud bell was ringing. The bedroom was dark and cold. I watched the other girls. They washed in cold water and they dressed quickly. There was a plain brown dress next to my bed. And there was a pair of ugly, heavy shoes. I washed quickly. Then I put on my new clothes. I was very hungry. I followed the other girls down the stairs. We sat down at long tables in a large dining room. Our food was terrible.
The food is bad again.
One of the girls said.
Stand up.
A teacher shouted.
Don't talk.
We stood up. We did not speak. We walked into a big schoolroom and we sat down. There were about 80 girls in the schoolroom. And there were 4 classes. The oldest girls were in the 4th class. I was in the 1st class. 4 teachers came into the room and we began our lessons. The lessons were not interesting. First, we read some pages in a book. Then our teacher asked us questions about those pages. After 4 hours, we went outside. It was very cold. Very soon, a bell rang. Lesson started again. 3 weeks passed. One afternoon, the head teacher came into the schoolroom. The head teacher's name was Miss Temple. Mr. Brocklehurst was with her. We all stood up. I stood behind an older girl. I did not want Mr. Brocklehurst to see me. Mr. Brocklehurst walked slowly round the room. Everybody was very quiet. And then I dropped my book. Mr. Brocklehurst stopped walking. He looked at me.
Ah, the new girl.
He said.
Come here, Jane Eyre.
Then he pointed at 2 of the older girls.
You 2 girls put Jane Eyre on that high chair.
He said.
Look at Jane Eyre, everybody.
Mr. Brocklehurst said.
This child is bad. She is a liar. She will be punished. Miss Temple. Teachers. Girls. Do not talk to this child.
Then he spoke to me again.
Jane Eyre, you must stand on that chair for 2 hours.
He said.
You are a bad girl.
That evening, I cried and cried. But Miss Temple was kind to me.
You are a good pupil, Jane.
She said.
And you are not a bad girl. I am your friend, Jane.
Thank you, Miss Temple.
I said. Lowood School was in an unhealthy place. The buildings were wet and cold. Mr. Brocklehurst owned the school. He was a rich man, but he did not buy warm clothes for us. And he did not buy good food for us. Everybody hated him. In the spring, many of the girls became sick. Some of them left the school. They never came back. Many of the girls died. That spring was a terrible time. We had no lessons. Miss Temple and the other teachers took care of the sick pupils. Mr. Brocklehurst had to buy better food for us. And he had to buy warm clothes for us. Mr. Brocklehurst never came to the school. The next year, Lowood School moved to a better place. It was a healthier place. There were new schoolrooms, new bedrooms, and a new dining room. The new buildings were bright and clean. The teachers were happy. After that, I was happy at Lowood School too. I was a pupil at Lowood School for 6 years. Then I became a teacher. I was a teacher at the school for 2 years. But I never returned to Gates at all. And the Reeds never wrote to me. Chapter 3, Thornfield Hall. In 1833, I was 18 years old. In the summer, Miss Temple left Lowood School. She got married. I wanted to leave Lowood too. I wanted a new life.
I will be a governess.
I thought. I put an advertisement in a newspaper. I had a reply to my advertisement. The reply was from Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield Hall, near Millcote. Millcote was about 70 miles from Lowood School. Mrs. Fairfax wanted a governess for a little girl. I wrote to Mrs. Fairfax immediately. I was going to be a governess at Thornfield Hall. I traveled to Millcote in a coach. At Millcote, a servant met me. He took me to Thornfield Hall. At Thornfield Hall, another servant opened the door. She was smiling. She took me into a small, warm room. A lady was in the room. She was sitting by the fire.
Are you Mrs. Fairfax?
I asked her.
Yes, my dear.
She said.
And you are Miss Eyre. Are you cold? Sit by the fire, Miss Eyre. A servant will bring you some food. Mrs. Fairfax is very kind.
I said to myself.
I will be happy here. Will I see Miss Fairfax tonight?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax looked at me. She smiled.
Miss Fairfax? No, no.
She said. Your pupil's name is not Miss Fairfax. Your pupil is Adele Varens. Adele's mother was a Frenchwoman. Adele is Mr. Rochester's ward. He takes care of her.
Mr. Rochester? Who is Mr. Rochester?
I asked.
Mr. Edward Rochester is the owner of Thornfield Hall.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
I am his housekeeper. I take care of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester is not here now. He does not like this house. He is often away from home.
I was very tired. Mrs. Fairfax took me up the wide stairs. She took me to my room. I went to bed immediately. And I slept well. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was shining. I put on a plain black dress. I opened my bedroom door. I walked along a corridor and down the wide stairs. I walked out into the sunny garden. I turned and I looked up at my new home. Thornfield Hall was a beautiful house with many large windows. The garden was beautiful too. After a few minutes, Mrs. Fairfax came into the garden. She spoke to me.
Good morning, Miss Irie.
She said.
You have woken early. Miss Adele is here. After breakfast, you must take her to the schoolroom. She must begin her lessons.
A pretty little girl walked towards me. She was about 8 years old. She spoke to me in French and I replied in French. After breakfast, I took Adele to the schoolroom. We worked all morning. Adele enjoyed her lessons and I was happy. In the afternoon, Mrs. Fairfax took me into all the rooms of Thornfield Hall. We looked at the paintings and at the beautiful furniture. We walked along the corridors.
Come up onto the roof, Miss Irie.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
You will see the beautiful countryside around Thornfield Hall.
We walked up many stairs. At last, we were at the top of the house. We walked along the top corridor. Mrs. Fairfax opened a small door and we walked onto the roof.
Look, Miss Irie.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
You can see for many miles.
We stood on the roof for a few minutes. Then we went back into the house. We walked carefully towards the stairs. The top corridor was narrow and dark. Suddenly, I heard a strange laugh.
Who is that, Mrs. Fairfax?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax did not reply. She knocked on a door.
Grace,
she said. The door opened. Behind the door was a small room. A servant was standing at the door.
Be quiet, Grace, please,
Mrs. Fairfax said. The woman looked at Mrs. Fairfax. Then she closed the door.
That was Grace Pooley,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
She works up here. Sometimes she laughs and talks with the other servants. Don't worry about Grace. Please come downstairs now, Miss Eyre.
Chapter 4 Mr. Rochester. 3 months passed. I had not met the owner of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester had not come home. One January afternoon, I went out and I walked towards the road. I was going to the village of Hay. I was going to post a letter in the village. Hay was 2 miles from Thornfield Hall. The day was fine, but it was very cold. I walked quickly and soon I was near the village. Suddenly, a big black and white dog ran past me. A moment later, a man on a black horse followed the dog. Then, I heard an angry shout. The dog ran past me again. It was barking loudly. I turned round. The horse had fallen on the icy ground and the man had fallen from the horse. One walked towards them.
Can I help you, sir?
I asked.
My horse fell. I've hurt my foot.
The man said. The horse stood up. The man tried to stand up too. But he could not stand. He fell onto the ground again. The man was about 35 years old. He was not handsome, but he had a strong face. He had dark eyes and black hair. He was not very tall, but his body was powerful.
I'll bring somebody from Thornfield Hall,
I said.
Do you live at Thornfield?
The man asked.
I am the governess.
I replied.
Yes, the governess.
The man said.
Help me, please.
The man stood up very slowly, and he put his hand on my shoulder. He walked slowly towards his horse. I helped him. He pulled himself onto the horse.
Thank you. Now go home quickly.
The man said. And he rode away. I walked onto the village and I posted my letter. Then I returned to Thornfield Hall. Bright lights were shining in the big house. I went inside. A big black and white dog walked towards me. It came from the dining room. I had seen the dog before.
Whose dog is that?
I asked a servant.
It's Mr. Rochester's dog.
The servant replied. Mr. Rochester has come home. But he has hurt his foot. His horse fell on some ice. I smiled. The owner of Thornfield Hall had returned. But I did not see Mr. Rochester again that day. I saw Mr. Rochester the next day. He sent for me in the evening. I put on a clean dress. I brushed my hair carefully. Mr. Rochester was in the large sitting room. He was sitting in a big chair. His right foot was on a small chair. Mr. S. Fairfax and Adele were sitting with him.
This is Miss Eyre, sir.
Mrs. Fairfax said. Mr. Rochester looked at me. He did not smile.
Sit by the fire, Miss Eyre.
He said.
Where have you come from?
From Lowood School.
I replied.
I was there for 8 years.
8 years.
Mr. Rochester said.
That is a long time. Who are your parents?
I have no parents, sir.
I answered.
They are dead.
But where is your home, Miss Eyre?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I have no home, sir. I have no family.
I said.
Why did you come to Thornfield Hall?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I wanted to leave Lowood, sir.
I replied.
I put an advertisement in a newspaper. Mrs. Fairfax replied to my advertisement. Yes, I did.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Miss Eyre is a good teacher, Mr. Rochester.
Mr. Rochester smiled for the first time.
You are very young, Miss Eyre.
He said.
I am 18, sir.
I replied. Mr. Rochester smiled again. He did not ask me more questions. After that evening, I did not see Mr. Rochester for a few days. Then, one night, he sent for me again.
Sit near me, Miss Irie.
He said.
Mrs. Fairfax will talk to Adele.
I sat down quietly, but I did not speak. The fire was very bright. One saw Mr. Rochester's face clearly. I saw his large, dark eyes. He was smiling. He was happy. After a minute, Mr. Rochester spoke.
Miss Eyre,
He said.
you are looking at me very carefully. Am I a handsome man?
No, sir.
I said.
You speak the truth, Miss Eyre.
Mr. Rochester said.
Look at me again. Am I a con man?
No, sir.
I said again.
You are smiling now. But you are not always kind.
That is true.
Mr. Rochester replied.
I have had a difficult life. I have met bad people. I have been a bad person myself. Now, Thornfield Hall is my home. But I hate this house. You are very young, Miss Eyre. You cannot understand me.
You are right. I don't understand you, sir.
I said. I stood up.
Where are you going?
Mr. Rochester asked.
It is late. Adele must go to bed.
I said.
Are you frightened of me, Miss Eyre?
Mr. Rochester asked.
No, sir.
I replied.
But you say strange things, sir.
Mr. Rochester smiled.
Take Adele to her bedroom now, Miss Eyre.
He said.
We will talk again tomorrow.
After that night, we talked together many times. Mr. Rochester was an interesting man. But he was a strange man, too. I often thought about him.
Why does Mr. Rochester hate Thornfield?
I asked myself.
Thornfield Hall is a beautiful place. But Mr. Rochester is not happy.
Chapter 5 Fire.
It was March. One night I was in bed. But I was not asleep. The house was quiet. Suddenly, I heard a sound in the corridor outside my room. Who's there? I said. Nobody answered. Then I heard a strange laugh. I got out of my bed and I went quietly to the door. I listened. I heard another sound. Somebody was walking up the stairs to the top corridor. Then I heard somebody close a door. Was that Grace Poole?
I said to myself.
Yes, it was Grace.
Why was she laughing? And why is she walking in the house at night? Is she mad? I must tell Mrs. Fairfax about this. I will speak to her now. I put on some clothes and I opened the door. There was a candle on the floor outside my room. The candle was burning. There was thick smoke in the corridor. I went into the corridor. I looked around me. The door of Mr. Rochester's bedroom was open, and the smoke was coming from Mr. Rochester's room. I ran into the room. I sat in a chair by the window. Time passed. At last, Mr. Rochester returned.
Please don't worry, Jane.
He said.
Grace Poole is a strange woman. But she won't hurt anybody tonight.
I stood up.
Good night, sir.
I said. Mr. Rochester held my hand. He looked at me and he smiled.
Thank you, my dear friend.
He said.
You saved my life tonight, Jane.
Good night, sir.
I said again. I went back to my bed. I was very tired. But at first, I could not sleep. Suddenly, I understood something. I loved Mr. Rochester. He had smiled at me. He had held my hand. Did he love me? I did not know. But I thought about Mr. Rochester for a long time. I did not see Mr. Rochester the next day. He did not send for me. In the evening, I went down to Mrs. Fairfax's sitting room. The housekeeper was looking out of the window.
The weather has been good today,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Mr. Rochester had a good day for his journey. His journey? Where has he gone?
I asked. I was surprised.
He has gone to Ingram Park.
Mrs. Fairfax replied.
Mr. Rochester will stay there for a week or more. He has many friends. All his friends will be at Ingram Park this week. Will there be any ladies at Ingram Park?
I asked.
Yes,
Mrs. Fairfax said.
there will be many ladies there. Miss Blanche Ingram will be there. Mr. Rochester has known her for many years. Is Miss Ingram beautiful?
I asked.
She is very beautiful.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Will Mr. Rochester marry her?
I asked. Mrs. Fairfax smiled.
I don't know, Miss Irie.
She replied.
I don't know.
I was very unhappy. I went up to my bedroom. I looked in my mirror.
Jane Eyre,
I said to myself.
you are not pretty, and you are poor. Mr. Rochester will never marry you. He will marry Miss Blanche Ingram. She is a rich lady. You are a poor governess. Forget Mr. Rochester, Jane Eyre, forget him.
Chapter 6 Guests at Thornfield Hall. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Mrs. Fairfax.
Mr. Rochester will return on Thursday.
Mrs. Fairfax said.
Some of his friends will come here with him. There will be many guests at Thornfield Hall.
On Thursday evening, Mrs. Fairfax, Adele and I were in Adele's bedroom. Mrs. Fairfax was looking out of the window.
The guests are arriving now,
Mrs. Fairfax said. I went to the window and I looked out. There were 3 carriages. 2 people were riding horses. Mr. Rochester was riding his big black horse. A beautiful young woman was riding a white horse. Mrs. Fairfax pointed to the young woman.
That is Miss Ingram.
The housekeeper said. Then she went downstairs. Adele wanted to go downstairs too.
No, Adele,
I said.
we cannot go downstairs tonight.
Mr. Rochester is talking to his guests. The next day, Mrs. Fairfax came into the schoolroom.
Mr. Rochester wants you to meet his guests tonight, Miss Irie.
She said.
Adele must meet them too.
Later, Adele and I went quietly into the sitting room. And soon, 8 ladies came into the room. One of them was tall, dark, and very beautiful. She was Blanche Ingram. Adele ran towards her.
Good evening, beautiful lady,
She said in French.
what a pretty little girl.
Blanche Ingram said. Miss Ingram spoke to the other ladies. And she spoke to Adele. But she did not speak to me. Half an hour later, the gentleman came into the room. I looked at Mr. Rochester. He saw me, but he did not speak to me. Miss Ingram pointed at Adele.
Why doesn't this little girl live at a school, Mr. Rochester?
She asked.
Adele learns her lessons at home.
Mr. Rochester replied.
She has a governess.
Oh, yes. That small woman by the window.
Miss Ingram said.
I had many governesses. I hated all of them. They were all ugly and stupid.
Later, Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester sang some songs together. Mr. Rochester had a fine voice. I listened to the songs, then I left the room. Mr. Rochester followed me.
What is wrong, Jane?
He asked.
Nothing is wrong, sir.
I said.
But I am tired. I am going to my room. Good night, sir.
You are tired. And you are unhappy too.
Mr. Rochester replied.
There are tears in your eyes. Rest now, Jane. But please come and meet my guests tomorrow evening. Don't forget, Jane.
The guests stayed at Thornfield Hall for 2 weeks. Every evening, I went to the sitting room with Adele. Nobody spoke to me. Mr. Rochester and Miss Ingram were always together. One afternoon, Mr. Rochester went to Millcote. He returned late in the evening. I met him at the front door.
Another guest has arrived, sir.
I told him.
His name is Mr. Mason. He has come from the West Indies.
Suddenly, Mr. Rochester's face was pale. He held my hand tightly.
Mason. The West Indies. Mason. He said.
Are you ill, sir? I asked.
Jane, my little friend, I've had a shock.
He said.
Bring me a glass of wine, please.
I went quickly to the dining room. I returned with a glass of wine and I gave it to Mr. Rochester.
What are my guests doing?
He asked.
They are eating and laughing, sir.
I replied.
Mr. Mason is talking to the other guests.
One day, they will all hate me.
Mr. Rochester said.
Now go into the dining room again. Tell Mason to meet me in the library.
I gave Mr. Mason the message. Then I went to my bedroom. I got into my bed. Later, I heard Mr. Rochester coming up the stairs with Mr. Mason. They were laughing and talking. Soon, I was asleep. Chapter 7, A Terrible Night. Some hours later, I woke up. A terrible cry had woken me. The moon was bright. Its light was shining through my window. I listened. Then I heard somebody shouting.
Help! Help! Rochester, help me!
The voice came from the top corridor.
Help! Help!
I got out of bed and I put on a dress and some shoes. I opened my door. All the guests were in the corridor outside the bedrooms. They were all asking questions.
What happened?
They asked.
Is there a fire? Who is hurt?
Where is Mr. Rochester?
I am here.
Mr. Rochester said. He was walking down the stairs from the top corridor.
What is wrong, Mr. Rochester?
Miss Ingram asked.
What has happened?
Nothing is wrong.
Mr. Rochester replied.
One of the servants has had a bad dream. Go back to bed.
I went back to my room, but something was wrong. I did not get into my bed. I waited. Soon, somebody knocked on my door. I opened the door. Mr. Rochester was standing in the corridor.
Jane, follow me. Do not make a sound.
Mr. Rochester said. We went up to the top corridor. Mr. Rochester unlocked a door and we went inside a room. Mr. Mason was sitting on a chair in the room. His face was pale. And his shirt was covered with blood. Then I heard a terrible laugh. The sound came from the next room.
Grace Poole is a madwoman.
I thought.
Why does Mr. Rochester have a mad servant?
Mr. Rochester spoke quietly to Mr. Mason.
I am going to bring a doctor, Richard.
He said. Then he spoke to me.
Stay here, Jane. Wash Mr. Mason's arm, but do not speak to him.
Mr. Rochester left the room. I washed Mr. Mason's arm. We waited for Mr. Rochester and the doctor. Mr. Mason did not speak to me and I did not speak to him. After 2 hours, Mr. Rochester returned. The doctor was with him. The doctor looked at Mr. Mason's arm.
She bit me.
Mr. Mason said.
I came up here. I wanted to see her. I wanted to help her. But she bit me.
Be quiet now. Richard.
Mr. Rochester said quickly. The doctor put a bandage on Mr. Mason's arm. Mr. Rochester put Mr. Mason's coat round the injured man's shoulders. Then he spoke to me again.
Run downstairs, Jane. Unlock the small door at the side of the houses.
He said.
We will follow you.
I went quickly downstairs and I opened the door. Outside the door, a servant was waiting with a carriage. Mr. Mason and the doctor came out of the house. They got into the carriage. Then Mr. Rochester came out of the house too. Mr. Mason spoke to him through the window of the carriage.
Help her. Be kind to her, Rochester.
He said.
Yes, I will, Mason.
Mr. Rochester said. The servant drove the carriage away.
Will you walk in the garden with me, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
I do not want to sleep now.
Yes, I will, sir.
I said. Soon, it was morning. The birds were beginning to sing. The flowers had a sweet smell.
It has been a strange night, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Were you frightened?
I am frightened of Grace Poole.
I said.
She will hurt you, one day.
I am stronger than she is. She will not hurt me.
Mr. Rochester said. He looked at me for a few moments.
Are you my friend, Jane?
He asked me.
Yes, sir, I will be your friend forever.
I replied.
Thank you, Mother.
Mr. Rochester said.
I have made mistakes. Now, I want to be happy. That is not wrong, is it, Jane?
He stopped speaking for a minute. Then he said.
Go into the house. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
But the next day, I had a letter from Gateshead Hall, my Aunt Reed's house. The letter was from my cousin Eliza. I started the journey to my Aunt Reed's house immediately. I arrived there the next day. My Aunt Reed was very, very ill. She could not move. And she did not speak to me. I wanted to return to Thornfield Hall. I wanted to see Mr. Rochester. But Eliza wanted me to stay at Gateshead Hall. After 3 weeks, my aunt spoke to me at last. She spoke very slowly.
Are you Jane Eyre?
She asked.
Yes, Aunt Reed. I am Jane Eyre.
I replied.
There is a letter for you.
Aunt Reed said.
It is in my desk. Call Eliza, please. She will get the letter.
Eliza came into the room. She opened the desk and she gave me a letter.
Read the letter, Jane.
My aunt said. The letter had come from Madeira. But it was 3 years old.
I answered that letter.
Aunt Reed said.
I hated you, Jane. I did not want you to have your uncle's money. I wrote to John Eyre. I wrote Jane Eyre is dead. She died at Lowood School. I am sorry, Jane. I was wrong.
Mrs. Reed died that night. I left Gateshead Hall a few days later. I took my uncle's letter with me. Mr. Rochester met me at Thornfield Hall.
Welcome back to my house.
He said.
This is your home, Jane.
Thank you, sir.
I said.
I am very happy here.
Mr. Rochester's guests had left. No other visitors came to Thornfield Hall. Every day, Mr. Rochester and I talked together. And every day, I loved him more. Chapter 8 In the Garden. In June, the weather was hot. One evening, I walked into the garden. Mr. Rochester was there too.
Do you like this house, Jane?
He asked.
Yes, sir.
I replied.
Soon, Adele will go to live at a school, Jane.
He said.
Then, I will not want a governess here. Will you be sad then, Jane? Will you leave Thornfield Hall?
Leave.
I said quickly.
Must I leave Thornfield?
My dear.
Mr. Rochester stopped. He was silent for a moment. Then he said,
I am going to be married soon.
Oh, sir.
I said.
Then I must go far away. Far away from Thornfield. Far away from you, sir.
I started to cry.
I will always remember you, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Will you forget me?
No, sir.
I replied.
I will never forget you. I don't want to leave Thornfield, sir. I don't want to leave you.
Don't leave, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Stay here.
He smiled at me.
I am poor. I do not have a pretty face. But I have a heart. It is a loving heart, sir.
Jane, I'm not going to marry Miss Ingram.
Mr. Rochester said.
She is rich. She is beautiful. You are poor. You are not beautiful. But I want to marry you. Will you marry me, Jane?
For a moment, I could not speak. At last, I asked.
Do you love me, sir?
I do.
He replied.
Then, sir, I will marry you.
I said. And Mr. Rochester kissed me.
My dearest Jane.
He said.
Nothing can stop our marriage now. We will be married in a month, Jane.
We kissed again. Then I said good night and I went into the house. I went upstairs to my room. Later, I remembered my Uncle John Eyre's letter.
I will write to him in Madeira.
I said to myself.
I will tell him about my marriage to Mr. Rochester. I am very happy. My uncle will be happy too.
4 weeks passed. Mr. Rochester was going to buy me many beautiful things. He was going to give me many presents. But I did not want these things.
No, Edward.
I said.
I'm not beautiful. I don't want beautiful things. I want you, Edward.
It was the month of July. 2 days before our wedding day, Mr. Rochester went away.
I will return tomorrow.
He said.
I love you, Jane.
That night, I went to my bedroom early. My wedding dress and my wedding veil were in my room. I looked at them.
In 2 days, I will be Jane Rochester.
I said to myself. Then I went to bed. But I did not sleep well. The next day, Mr. Rochester returned. He looked at me carefully.
What is wrong, Jane?
He asked.
Your face is pale. Are you frightened?
I had a very strange dream last night.
I said.
It was a dream about this house. But in my dream, Thornfield Hall had no roof. The walls were burnt. They were black. In my dream, I tried to find you. But you were not in the house.
Are you afraid of a dream, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
No, Edward.
I replied.
But I woke up from my dream. There was a woman in my room. She was tall and heavy. She had long black hair. The woman was holding a candle.
I said.
She put candle by my mirror. She put my wedding veil over her head and she looked in the mirror. Then I saw her face. It was a strange, terrible face, Edward. Suddenly, the woman tore my veil into 2 pieces. She threw the pieces on the floor.
What happened next?
The woman held her candle near my face. She looked at me and she laughed. Then she went away.
This happened in your dream, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
It did not happen in my dream, Edward.
I said.
This morning, my wedding veil was on the floor of my room. It was torn. It was in 2 pieces.
But the woman did not hurt you, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
Sleep in Adele's room tonight, my dear. You will have no more bad dreams.
Chapter 9, Mr. Rochester's Wife. It was our wedding day. We were going to be married in a church near Thornfield Hall. After the marriage, we were going to travel to London. I got up early. I put on my wedding dress and I went downstairs. Mr. Rochester was waiting for me. At 8 o'clock, we walked together to the church. The clergyman was standing by the door of the church. There were 2 other people inside the church, 2 men. They were sitting in a dark corner. I could not see them very well. The clergyman started to speak. At every marriage, the clergyman asks an important question. He asks the people in the church,
Is there a problem about this marriage?
The clergyman spoke loudly. He asked this question and he waited. There was silence for a moment. And then one of the men in the dark corner stood up. He spoke loudly.
There is a problem. These 2 people must not be married.
He said.
There is not a problem.
Mr. Rochester said to the clergyman.
Please go on with the marriage.
No, I cannot go on with the marriage.
The clergyman replied. He spoke to the man in the corner.
What is the problem, sir?
He asked. Mr. Rochester turned and looked at the man.
Who are you? What do you know about me?
He asked angrily.
My name is Briggs, sir. I am a lawyer.
The man replied.
I know many things about you. 15 years ago, you were married in the West Indies. Your wife's name is Bertha Mason. She is alive. She lives at Thornfield Hall.
How do you know that?
Mr. Rochester shouted. The other man in the dark corner stood up. He walked towards us. It was Richard Mason.
Bertha Mason is my sister.
He said.
I saw her at Thornfield Hall in April.
Mr. Rochester's face was pale. For a minute he was silent. Then he spoke quietly.
It is true,
he said.
My wife is living at Thornfield Hall. She is mad. Come to the house, all of you. Come and see Mrs. Rochester. Come and see the madwoman.
We all left the church. Nobody spoke. At Thornfield, Mrs. Fairfax and Adele were waiting for us. They were smiling happily.
Nobody will be happy today.
Mr. Rochester said.
We are not married.
Briggs, Mr. Mason, the clergyman and I followed Mr. Rochester. We followed him up the stairs. He took us to the top corridor. He unlocked a door and we went into a small room. I had seen this room before. We walked through the room to another door. Mr. Rochester unlocked this door and we saw a larger room. Grace Poole was sitting in the room. But another woman was there too. She was tall and heavy. Her dark hair was in front of her face. The woman turned and looked at us. I knew that terrible, mad face. I had seen it in my bedroom 2 nights before. The madwoman saw Mr. Rochester. She screamed and she ran towards him. The madwoman was very strong. She screamed and she hit Mr. Rochester. But Mr. Rochester held her arms.
This woman is my wife.
Mr. Rochester said angrily.
I wanted to forget about her. I wanted to marry this young girl, Jane Eyre. Was I wrong?
He was silent for a few moments. Then he spoke quietly.
Yes. I was wrong.
He said.
I love Jane Eyre. But I was wrong. Now go, all of you. I must take care of my mad wife.
I went slowly downstairs. Mr. Briggs, the lawyer, spoke to me.
I am sorry for you, Miss Eyre.
He said.
You did nothing wrong. Your uncle, John Eyre, is sorry for you too. He read your letter. And then he met Richard Mason in Madeira. Your uncle is dying, Miss Eyre. He could not come to England. He sent me here. He wanted me to stop this marriage.
I did not answer. I went to my room and I locked the door. I took off my wedding dress. I put on a plain black dress. I lay down on my bed.
I am Jane Eyre today.
I thought.
I will be Jane Eyre tomorrow. I will never be Jane Rochester. I must leave Thornfield Hall. I must never see Mr. Rochester again. My life here is finished.
Many hours later, I got off the bed. I unlocked my door. Mr. Rochester was waiting outside my room.
You are unhappy, Jane.
He said.
I am very, very sorry. Jane, we will leave Thornfield. We will go to another country. We will be happy again.
I cannot be your wife. I cannot live with you.
I said.
I must leave you, Edward.
Listen, Jane.
Mr. Rochester said.
My father wanted me to marry Bertha Mason. Her family was very rich. I married her. My father was happy. But I was not happy. Bertha was mad, and she was a bad woman. Nobody told me about her. She was married to me, but she met other men. She was drunk every day. She tried to kill me many times. After 4 years, I brought Bertha here to Thornfield Hall.
Mr. Rochester said.
Then I went away. Gray's Pool took care of Bertha. I met other women. One of them was a French singer. She was Adele's mother. Adele is my daughter, Jane. But I did not love the French singer. I did not love anybody. I came home to Thornfield Hall. Then you came here and I loved you. I will always love you. Please stay with me, Jane.
No, Edward.
I said.
I am going away. We will be unhappy. But we must not be together. Goodbye, Edward.
Oh, Jane. Jane, my love.
Mr. Rochester said.
Don't leave me.
I kissed Mr. Rochester.
God will help you, Edward.
I said. Quickly, I went into my room. I put some clothes into a bag. Later, I heard Mr. Rochester go into his room. Very quietly, I went downstairs. I opened the small door at the side of the house. I left Thornfield Hall and one walked to the road. It was dark. Soon, a coach came along the road. I gave all my money to the driver of the coach. I got into the coach. Many hours later, the coach stopped. It was 10 o'clock in the morning.
You must give me more money now.
The driver said.
I have no more money.
I said.
You have no more money? Then you must get out of the coach.
The driver said. I got down onto the road. The coach moved away quickly. But I had left my bag in the coach. I looked around me. I was on a cold, empty moor. I was tired and hungry. I walked and walked. I had no money. I had no food. I walked until the evening came. At last, I lay down on the ground. I fell asleep immediately. Chapter 10, More House. The next morning, I woke late. I walked along the road for many miles. It started to rain. Soon my clothes were wet. I saw no one. I walked on the moor all day. In the evening, I was very tired again.
I must sleep soon.
I thought.
Where shall I sleep?
Then I saw a light. I walked slowly towards it. The rain was falling heavily. But I saw a house near the road. I walked up to the house. I knocked on the door. I waited, but nobody opened the door. I stood outside the house. I was very cold and very tired. I could not move.
I am going to die here,
I said. Then I heard a young man's voice. The man was standing behind me.
No, you will not die at more houses,
the man said. Then he unlocked the door of the house. He took me into the house. He took me into a warm sitting room.
Please sit down,
he said. Two pretty young women came into the room.
Give this poor woman some food, Diana.
The young man said.
Give her some dry clothes, Mary.
Then he spoke to me again.
My name is St. John Rivers,
he said.
These are my sisters, Diana and Mary. What is your name, young woman?
My name is Jane Elliot,
I said. I closed my eyes.
Jane is very tired.
Diana said.
She must go to bed now.
I stayed in bed at Moore House for 3 days. Diana and Mary Rivers were governesses. They were staying at Moore House for a few days. St. John, their brother, was a clergyman. They were very kind to me. Soon, we were good friends. One day, St. John asked me about my life.
I was a governess too,
I told him. And I told him about Lowood School. But I did not tell him about Thornfield Hall. I did not tell him about Mr. Rochester.
I want to work, St. John,
I said.
Will you help me? I have a plan.
St. John said.
A few miles from here, there is a village. Many of the girls in the village cannot read or write. I am going to pay for a girls' school in the village. But I must find a teacher for these girls.
I will teach them, St. John,
I said.
Good.
He said.
There will be a small house next to the school. You will live there.
3 days later, a letter arrived for St. John.
Diana, Mary, or Uncle John is dead.
He told his sisters.
But we will not have any of his money.
He gave the letter to his sisters. They read it.
Uncle John was our mother's brother.
Diana told me.
He was very rich. But he has given all his money to another niece. We do not know her.
Soon, I went to live in the village. I lived in the house next to the school. Every day, I taught the girls. My pupils worked hard. But I was not happy. Every day, I thought about Edward Rochester.
Does he think about me?
I asked myself. 4 months passed. One day, St. John Rivers came to my house. He was holding a letter. He was worried.
What is wrong?
I asked.
I want to ask you 3 questions, Jane.
He replied.
Is your name Jane Elliot? Do you have another name? Do you know Jane Eyre?
I looked at him for a moment. I did not speak.
I have some news for Jane Eyre.
St. John said.
Jane Eyre was a pupil at Lowood School. And she was a teacher there. Then she was a governess at Thornfield Hall, the home of Mr. Edward Rochester.
How do you know this?
I asked.
What do you know about Mr. Rochester? How is he?
I don't know.
St. John said.
This letter is from a lawyer. The lawyer tells a story about Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester had a mad wife. But he tried to marry Jane Eyre. She left Thornfield. Now, this lawyer, Mr. Briggs, is trying to find her.
I will tell you the truth, St. John.
I said.
My name is not Jane Elliot. My name is Jane Eyre. And I was a governess at Thornfield Hall. I know Mr. Rochester. Did Mr. Briggs write anything about Mr. Rochester?
No, the letter is about you, Jane.
St. John said.
Your Uncle John Eyre is dead. John Eyre has given you £20,000. You are rich, Jane.
But why did Mr. Briggs write to you?
I asked.
My mother's name was Erie.
St. John said.
She was your father's sister, Jane.
Then you, Diana, and Mary are my cousins.
I said. I thought carefully for a moment.
Write to Diana and Mary.
I said.
They must come home. I will give all of you some of Uncle John's money.
The next day, I wrote to Mr. Briggs. I gave St. John, Diana, and Mary £5,000 each. I wrote to Mrs. Fairfax too, but she did not reply. 6 months passed. I heard nothing from Thornfield Hall. I heard nothing about Mr. Rochester. Then, one day, I was walking on the moor. Suddenly, I heard a voice. There was nobody on the moor. But the voice was calling my name.
Jane, Jane, Jane.
That is Mr. Rochester's voice.
I said to myself. Then I shouted.
I am coming, Edward. I am coming.
I ran to Moor House. I spoke to my cousins.
I am going to Thornfield Hall tomorrow.
I told them. I began my journey the next day. Chapter 11. My story ends. 2 days later, I got out of a coach. I was standing on the road near Thornfield Hall. I ran across the fields. Was Mr. Rochester at Thornfield? Was he ill? And then I saw the house. The house had no roof. Its walls were burnt and black. Nobody was living there. I looked at the burnt black house. I had seen this before. I had seen it in a dream. I was frightened. Where was Edward Rochester? I went to the village of Hay. I asked about Thornfield Hall. I asked about Mr. Rochester.
3 months ago, there was a fire at Thornfield Hall.
A man told me.
The madwoman burned the house. She was Mr. Rochester's wife.
Was Mr. Rochester in the house?
I asked.
Yes, he was there.
The man replied.
He tried to save his wife's life. He went into the burning house. But the madwoman jumped from the roof. She died.
Was Mr. Rochester hurt?
I asked quickly.
Yes, he was badly hurt.
The man said.
He is blind, he can't see. And he has only one hand.
Where is he? I asked.
Where is he?
He is living at Ferndean. It is an old house, about 30 miles away.
The man said.
Do you have a carriage?
I asked.
I must go to Ferndean immediately.
I got out of the carriage near Ferndean. I walked to the house. I knocked on the door. A servant opened it. I knew her.
Oh, Miss Eyre. You have come.
She said.
Mr. Rochester has been calling your name.
A bell rang in another room.
That is Mr. Rochester's bell.
The woman said.
He wants some candles.
There were 2 candles on a table near the door. The woman lit them and she picked them up.
Mr. Rochester is blind, but he always burns candles in his room in the evenings.
She said.
Give the candles to me.
I said.
I'll take them to him.
I opened the door of Mr. Rochester's room. His black and white dog was sitting by the fire. The dog jumped up and ran towards me.
Who is there?
Mr. Rochester said.
Don't you know me, Edward?
I asked.
Your dog knows me.
I put the candles on a table. I held Mr. Rochester's hand.
I know that voice. And I know this little hand.
Mr. Rochester said.
Is that you, Jane?
Yes, sir, I have found you at last.
I said.
I will never leave you again.
Then I told Mr. Rochester my story.
Why did you leave your cousins, Jane?
Mr. Rochester asked.
Why did you come back to me? I am blind. I have only one hand.
I will take care of you, Edward.
I said.
But I don't want a servant.
Mr. Rochester replied.
I want a wife.
You will have a wife, Edward.
I said.
I will be your wife. I will marry you. I loved you very much at Thornfield Hall. Now I love you more.
Mr. Rochester and I got married. After a time, his eyes were better. He could see a little. He saw the face of our first child. My dear Edward and I are very happy.
Chapter 1. A Letter for Adam. One day a postman came to my village. The postman brought me a letter from my son, Saul.
Is your name Adam?
The postman asked.
Yes.
I said.
I have got a letter for you.
The postman read the envelope.
Adam of the village of Minta.
A letter for me. Who is it from?
I asked. The postman looked at the envelope again.
From Saul.
He said. He gave me the letter and walked away.
Martha, Martha.
I called to my wife.
Come here. We have a letter from our son, Saul.
Martha came out and looked at the letter. She was excited, but she was also worried. Short story in English, Martha.
A letter from Saul.
She said.
Is he alive and well? I'm going to find the school teacher. He can read the letter.
There was no school 50 years ago. So I cannot read or write. I live in a small village. The only work is farming. My only son, Saul, left the village 2 years ago and my 3 daughters are married. Saul is making a lot of money in a foreign country. Short story in English, The School Teacher. Martha and the school teacher came back. A lot of other people came. Everyone wanted to hear my letter. The school teacher opened the envelope and read the letter.
20 Taylor Street, London E. 19, England, the 16th of March. Dear Father, I am living in London. I have a job in a factory. The work is very hard. I often work at night. But the pay is good. I am well and I live with people from my country. I am sending you £100 in this letter. This is for you and my mother. Love to you and mother. Saul.
£100.
I said to the school teacher.
You're wrong. It's a mistake.
No.
The school teacher said.
I'm not wrong. It's not a mistake. Here is the money.
And he gave me a piece of paper.
What is this?
I asked.
A money order.
The school teacher said.
Go to Darper. Take this money order to the post office in Darper. The money order is worth £100. The post office official will give you the money.
£100.
I said again. Everyone laughed and said,
Adam, you are a rich man. You can buy many things for your farm and for your house.
And I can buy some good food and drink in Darper. I am going to give a party for you all.
I told my friends. Martha said.
Saul is a good son.
That evening, the village people talked about the money order and my money. Martha and I also talked about the money. We needed many things for the farm. Chapter 2, Adam goes to Darper. The next morning I got up very early. It was dark and everyone was asleep. But I was going to Darper. I washed and dressed carefully. I put on my best clothes and I carried my best stick. I put the money order carefully in my pocket and I said goodbye to Martha. I walked 10 miles to the main road. I sat down at the main road and ate my breakfast. I waited for the bus. I waited for 2 hours. Then the bus came and I got on. It is a long way to Darper. The bus takes 3 hours. I arrived in Darper and walked to the post office immediately. I do not often go to Darper. I only know the market and one shop. This is the shop of Rick. I buy things for my farm from Rick. There were a lot of people in the post office. I asked about money orders. A man showed me the queue. There was a long line of people and I waited at the back. Finally, it was my turn. I was at the front of the queue. But the official did not serve me.
Excuse me,
I said.
It's my turn. I'm next.
You are next, old man. I'm very busy.
The official said.
Look at my papers. Look at all these people. I am very busy. And you must wait.
So I waited. Finally, the official looked at me.
What do you want?
He asked. I gave him my money order.
This is my money order for £100.
I replied. The official held out his hand.
Identity card.
He said.
Excuse me. I don't understand.
I replied.
Your identity card.
The official said again.
Give me your identity card.
What is an identity card?
I asked.
I can't give you any money for this money order. First, I must see your identity card. Your identity card gives your name and your address. Your identity card describes you. There is a photograph of you in your identity card. I don't know you. Who are you?
The official was a little angry. But I was also angry.
Who am I?
I said.
Everyone knows me. I am Adam of the village of Minta. I haven't got an identity card and I don't need an identity card.
Old man, I'm very busy and you're very stupid.
The official said.
Who are you? Where is Minta?
Give me my money. Give me my £100.
I said. The official looked angry and said.
Show me your identity card. I don't know you.
The official gave back my money order and he turned away.
Where can I buy an identity card?
I asked the official. He did not speak to me. He did not answer.
Go to the Ministry of the Interior.
A man said. He was standing in the queue. And he told me the way. Chapter 3, An Identity Card. I walked to the Ministry of the Interior. I waited in another queue. I spoke to another official. I asked for an identity card.
Fill in this application form.
The official said.
and bring the form and 3 photographs of yourself and £2. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow?
I said.
Can I have an identity card today, please? I live in Minta. I live 5 hours journey from Darper. I'm an old man. Yes, come back tomorrow.
And the official turned away. I walked away from the Ministry of the Interior. I walked to the market. At the market, I looked at everyone. I was looking for a man from my village, but I could not find a villager. So then I walked to the shop of Rick. I spoke to Rick.
I want an identity card. I told him. But I need 3 photographs of myself.
I see. You need some photographs.
And he showed me the way to a photographer. I found the house. The photographer was asleep, but he came to me quickly. The man's clothes were dirty and he looked tired.
I need an identity card.
I said.
I want 3 photographs of myself.
Yes, you want 3 photographs of yourself.
The photographer replied.
And I take very good photographs. Come and see my camera.
Short story in English, the photographer. We walked into his room. In the middle of the room was a large camera.
This is the best camera in Darper. This camera is very, very good.
The photographer said proudly.
I've never seen a camera.
I said.
I don't know about cameras. Hurry up and take a photograph of me.
Please do not hurry me, old man.
The photographer said.
I am an artist.
And he gave me a mirror and a comb.
I don't want a mirror. I don't want a comb. Please take my photograph. I'm going to Minta this afternoon. And I'm in a hurry.
I said.
Yes.
He said.
But first the price. This is the best camera in Darper, and I'm the best photographer. 3 photographs will cost you £2.50.
£2.50?
And I laughed.
£2.50 and pay me now, please.
The photographer answered.
I did not know the price of photographs. What could I do? Then the photographer said, You are an old man. For you, the price is £2.
So I gave him the money and he took the photographs.
Come back tomorrow morning.
He said.
I want my 3 photographs now, immediately.
I said.
Don't be stupid.
The photographer said.
Photographs take 24 hours. Come back tomorrow.
What could I do? So I said.
Yes. Tomorrow morning.
Good,
said the photographer.
Now go. I have a lot of work. I'm very busy.
I went back to the bus station. I sat on the bus for 3 hours. I walked 10 miles back to my village. It was night time and I was very tired. Martha and my friends were waiting for me.
Where is the money?
Martha asked.
I have no money. I cannot change the money order. First, I must an identity card.
And I told Martha everything.
Tomorrow I am going to Darper again.
I said. Then I did not talk again. I was very tired and it was late at night. I lay on my bed and I slept. Chapter 4. No photographs. I woke up late the next morning. The sun was already high. I did not walk to the main road and catch a bus. All the buses go to Darper early in the morning. So I stayed at home on Wednesday. I was still very, very tired. I rested and talked to the villagers about the money order. I told them about the identity card and the photographer. The school teacher said,
Yes, the official is correct. In a post office, you always show your identity card.
The school teacher filled in my application form for an identity card. Application form for identity card. Name, Adam Jamie. Address, Village of Minta. Age, 72 years. Place of birth, Village of Minta. Occupation, farmer. Color of eyes, brown. On Thursday, I traveled to Darper again. I walked to the main road and I caught a bus. In Darper, I walked to the house of the photographer. I knocked on the door of the house. No one came to the door. I knocked again loudly with my stick. A woman opened the door.
Who are you? What do you want?
She asked.
Can I have my photographs, please?
I said.
Your photographs? I have no photographs. The woman replied.
I came here on Tuesday. Where is the photographs?
I asked.
He's out. He's not here.
And the woman closed the door. I shouted at her.
I'm waiting here for him.
After a long time, the photographer came back. He looked tired and he smelt of beer.
Give me my photographs.
I said.
I have waited a long time for you.
The photographer looked at me and said,
I don't know you, old man. What photographer are you talking about?
My 3 photographs for my identity card. I paid you £2 for them on Tuesday. Give me my photographs immediately or my money.
Your photographs. Your money. What are you talking about?
The photographer said.
Show me the paper. Show me the receipt for your money.
My receipt?
I asked.
Yes. Where is your receipt?
The photographer asked.
You didn't give me a receipt.
I shouted.
Give me my photographer or my money immediately.
And I hit the photographer hard with my stick. I am old, but still strong. The photographer fell on the ground. He shouted.
Help! Help! This old man is killing me.
And I hit him hard again. Lots of people ran out of their houses. I hit the photographer again, and 2 men held me. I could not get away from the 2 men. The photographer was very angry, and I was very angry. Lots of people were shouting. Then a policeman came. The photographer shouted to the policeman.
This old man hit me 3 times with his stick. He's a thief and a murderer. He wants my money.
The policeman held my arm and said,
Come with me to the police station.
I did not say anything. We walked to the police station. At the police station, the policeman asked me,
Did you hit that man 3 times?
Yes.
I said.
He didn't give me my photographs.
Show me your identity card,
said the policeman.
I am Adam of Minta Village,
I replied.
And I haven't got an identity card.
Old man,
said the policeman.
Go back to your village. Don't come here and fight. Keep out of Darper.
And he pushed me into the street. I went back to my village. I was tired and angry. Chapter 5. Adam changes his money order. Next day, I told my story to all the villagers. The villagers were angry. Martha was very unhappy. She said,
Saul is working very hard. He is sending money and we can't have the money. What are we going to do?
I did not know. Then in the evening the school teacher came to my house again.
Adam. Perhaps I can help you.
The school teacher said.
Here is a letter to Mr. Sheth.
Mister,
I said.
Who is he?
He's an important man in Darper and he's a friend of my wife's cousin.
Replied the school teacher.
This letter is to Mr. Sheth. The letter is about your money order. Perhaps he can help you.
I took the letter and thanked the school teacher. So I traveled to Darper again on Saturday, for the third time. After a long time, I found Mr. Sheth's house. The door was opened by a tall man.
Can I see Mr. Sheth?
I asked.
And who are you?
The tall man asked.
I have a letter for Mr. Sheth.
I replied.
I see. Can I have the letter, please?
And the tall man held out his hand.
The letter is here.
I said. And I took the letter out of my pocket.
But I must see Mr. Sheth.
Many people want to see Mr. Sheth.
The tall man told me.
He is a very busy man and a very important man. Mr. Sheth is not here at the moment. But give me your letter, and Mr. Sheth will read it later.
Short story in English, Mr. Sheth. I gave the tall man the letter. Then I waited. Later, a large black car came and a man went into the house. A long time later, the tall man opened the door again.
Come in now, please, and follow me.
He said. I followed the tall man. We went into a large room with fine carpets and big chairs. Another man was in the room. He was drinking.
This is Mr. Sheth,
said the tall man.
I am Adam of Minta Village,
I replied.
Yes, I know,
said Mr. Sheth.
Thank you for the letter. I hope I can help you. I like to help people. Please, sit down.
Mr. Sheth smiled. His clothes were new and smart.
Thank you,
I said.
Can I see the money order, please?
Mr. Sheth asked. I took the money order out of my pocket. By now, the money order was dirty and looked very old. I gave it to Mr. Sheth.
This money order is for £100,
I said.
My son sent it from a foreign country.
Mr. Sheth unfolded the money order and looked at it.
You can't change this money order,
he said.
This money order is not worth £100. This money is worth nothing.
Worth nothing. Worthless?
I asked. Then Mr. Sheth looked at the money order again.
Yes, worthless. Your son does not understand about money orders. This money order is not correct for our country,
Mr. Sheth said. Then he looked at the money order again and said,
and this money order is also old. It is out of date.
I said nothing. Mr. Sheth gave me the money order back. Then Mr. Sheth smiled and said,
I am very sorry. You are an old man. You came a long way from your village. What can I give you to eat and drink?
I was not hungry. But Mr. Sheth went out of the room. Then he brought me some coffee and some cakes. I drank my coffee.
Old man,
said Mr. Sheth.
I like to help people. I am a rich man. Give me your money order.
I gave my money order to Mr. Sheth.
Yes, this money order is worthless,
he said again.
But I am going to help you. I am going to change this money order for you. I am going to give you some money.
Mr. Sheth went out of the room. I felt very happy again. After a few minutes, the tall man came into the room. He gave me an envelope.
This is from Mr. Sheth. You can go now.
the tall man said. I went out of the house. I walked along the road to the bus station. I opened the envelope and I took out my money. I counted the money. It was 10 pounds. I thought about my only son, Saul. My son, Saul, had sent me a money order for 100 pounds. Mr. Chef had given me 10 pounds. I felt old and I felt poor again.
Chapter 1. From San Francisco to London. When I was 27 years old, I worked in an office in San Francisco. I did my job well, and my future was promising. I was alone in the world and I was happy. On Saturday afternoons I didn't work. I sailed my little sailboat on San Francisco Bay. One Saturday afternoon, I sailed out too far. The strong afternoon wind pushed my sailboat out of the bay into the Pacific Ocean. That night, when I had lost all hope, a small British brig saw me and took me on board. The brig was sailing to London. The voyage was long and stormy. I worked as a sailor to pay for my trip. When I arrived in London, my clothes were old and dirty. I had only $1 in my pocket. With this dollar, I ate and slept for the first 24 hours. During the next 24 hours, I didn't eat and didn't sleep. At about 10 o'clock the following morning, I went to Portland Place. I saw a child walking past, holding a big pear. The child ate one small piece and then threw the pear onto the street. I stopped and looked at it. I was very hungry and I really wanted that pear. But every time I tried to get it, someone passed by and looked at me. I quickly turned in the other direction and waited for the person to pass by. I tried again and again to get that pear, but the same thing happened. I was desperate. I decided to get the pear and not to worry about the people who saw me. At that moment, a gentleman opened a window behind me and said,
"Come in here, please."
A well-dressed servant opened the door. He took me to a beautiful room. Here, two old gentlemen were sitting and discussing something important. Their breakfast was on the table. I was very hungry and I stared at their breakfast. I want to tell the reader that the two gentlemen had made a bet several days before. I knew nothing about the bet until later. Let me tell you what happened. Chapter 2. An Unusual Bet. The two old gentlemen were brothers. For several days, they argued about a very strange subject. They decided to end their argument with a bet, as the English usually do. The following was the subject of the bet. The Bank of England issued 2 banknotes of $1 million each for a public transaction with a foreign country. England used one banknote and the other remained in the bank. At this point, Brother A said to Brother B,
If an honest and intelligent stranger arrives in London without a friend and without money, except for the $1 million banknote, he will starve to death.
Brother B answered,
No, I don't agree.
Brother A said,
If he goes to the bank or anywhere else to change this big note, the police will put him in prison. Everyone will think he stole it.
They continued arguing for days until Brother B said,
I'll bet $20,000 that the stranger will live for 30 days with the banknote and not go to prison.
Brother A accepted the bet. He went to the bank and bought the $1 million banknote. After, he returned home and prepared a letter. Then the two brothers sat by the window and waited for the right man for the bet. They saw a lot of honest faces go by, but they were not intelligent enough. Several faces were intelligent, but they were not honest. A lot of faces were honest and intelligent, but they were not poor enough. Other faces were honest, intelligent, and poor, but they were not strangers. When they saw me from the window, they thought I was the right man. They asked me questions, and soon they knew my story. Finally, they told me I was the right man for the bet. I asked them to explain the bet. One of the gentlemen gave me an envelope. I wanted to open it, but he said,
No, don't open it now. Wait until you are in your hotel room. Then read it very carefully.
I was confused and I wanted to discuss the subject with them. But they didn't. I felt hurt because I was the subject of a joke. When I left their house, I looked for the pair on the street. It was gone. I was quite angry with those two gentlemen. Far from their house, I opened the envelope. I saw that there was money inside. I didn't stop to read their letter. I ran to the nearest eating place. I ate and ate and ate. At last, I took out the envelope with the money to pay for my meal. I looked at the banknote and almost fainted. It was a banknote worth $5 million. I was speechless. I stared at the banknote. The two gentlemen had made a big mistake. They probably wanted to give me a $1 banknote. I saw the owner of the eating place staring at the banknote too. We were both surprised. I did not know what to do or say. So I simply gave him the note and said,
Give me the change, please.
The owner apologized 1,000 times.
I'm very sorry, but I can't change this banknote, sir.
I don't have any other money. Please change this note.
The owner then said,
You can pay for this food whenever you want, sir. I understand that you are a very rich gentleman. You like playing jokes on people by dressing like a poor man. You can come here and eat all you want, whenever you want. You can pay me when you want.
Chapter 3, The Letter. When I arrived, the same servant opened the door. I asked for the two gentlemen.
They are gone.
The servant said,
Gone? Gone where?
Oh, on a journey.
But where did they go?
To the continent, I think.
The continent?
There were no signature, no address, no date on the letter. How strange! I didn't know what to think. I went to a park, sat down, and thought about what to do. After an hour, I reached the decision that follows. The two old gentlemen are playing a game that I don't understand. They are betting on me. But at that time, I didn't know anything about the details of the bet. If I go to the Bank of England to return the banknote, the bank will ask me lots of questions. If I tell the truth, no one will believe me. They will put me in an asylum. If I tell a lie, the police will put me in prison. I can't even give it to anyone, because no honest person will want it. I can do only one thing. I must keep the bill for a whole month. And I must not lose it. If I help the old man to win his bet, he will give me the job I want. The idea of an important job with a big salary made me happy. With this exciting idea in mind, I began walking down the streets of London. Chapter 4 At the Tailor's. Every time I passed in front of a tailor's, I wanted to enter and buy some new clothes. But I had no money to pay for them. The $1 million banknote in my pocket was useless. I passed in front of the same tailor's 6 times. At last I entered. I quietly asked if they had an old, unattractive suit that no one wanted to buy. The man I spoke to nodded his head, but he didn't speak. Then another man looked at me and nodded his head. I went to him and he said,
"One moment, please."
After some time, he took me to a back room. He looked at several ugly suits that no one wanted. He chose the worst for me. I really wanted a suit, so I said nothing. It was time to pay.
Can you wait a few days for the money? I haven't got any small change with me.
The man said.
Oh, you haven't? Well, I thought gentlemen like you carried large change.
My friend,
I replied.
you can't judge a stranger by the clothes he wears. I can pay for this suit. But can you change a large banknote?
Oh, of course we can change a large banknote.
He said coldly. I gave him the banknote. He received it with a smile, a big smile that covered his face. When he read the banknote, his smile disappeared. The owner of the shop came over and asked me,
What's the trouble?
There isn't any trouble. I'm waiting for my change.
Come. Give him his change, Todd. Quickly.
Todd answered.
It's easy to say, but look at the banknote.
The owner looked at the banknote. Then he looked at my package with the ugly suit.
Todd,
He shouted.
you are stupid. How can you sell this unattractive suit to a millionaire? Todd, you can't see the difference between a millionaire and a poor man.
I apologize, sir.
The owner continued.
Please take off those things you are wearing and throw them in the fire. Put on this fine shirt and this handsome suit. It's perfect for you, simple but elegant.
I told him I was very happy with the new suit.
Oh, wait until you see what we can make for you in your size.
Todd, bring a pen and a book. Let me measure your leg, your arm. Todd, bring a pen and a book. Let me measure your leg, your arm. I didn't have a moment to speak. The owner measured me. Then he ordered his tailors to make me morning suits, evening suits, shirts, coats, and other things.
But, my dear sir,
I said,
I can order all these things only if you change my banknote. Or, if you can wait a while before I pay you.
Wait a while. I'll wait forever. That's the word. Todd, send these things to the gentleman's address. Let the less important customers wait.
What's your address, sir?
I'm changing my home. I'll come back and give you my new address. I replied.
Quite right, sir, quite right. Let me show you to the door, sir. Good day, sir, good day.
Chapter 5 The Poor Millionaire. The impossible happened. I bought everything I wanted without money. I showed my banknote and asked for change, but every time the same thing happened. No one was able to change it. I bought all that I needed and all the luxuries that I wanted. I stayed at an expensive hotel in Hanover Square. I always had dinner at the hotel, but I preferred having breakfast at Harris's simple eating place. Harris's was the first place where I had a good meal with my $1 million note. That's where it all started. The news about me and my banknote was all over London. Harris's eating place became famous because I had breakfast there. Harris was happy with all his new customers. I lived like a rich, important man. I had money to spend. I lived in a dream. But often I said to myself,
Remember, this dream will end when the two men return to London. Everything will change.
my story was in the newspapers. Everyone talked about the strange millionaire with the $1 million note in his pocket. Punch magazine drew a funny picture of me on the front page. People talked about everything I did and about everything I said. They followed me in the streets. I kept my old clothes and sometimes I wore them. It was fun when the shop owners thought I was poor. Then I showed them the banknote, and oh, how their faces changed. After 10 days in London, I went to visit the American ambassador. He was very happy to meet me. He invited me to a dinner party that evening. He told me that he knew my father from Yale University. He invited me to visit his home whenever I wanted. I was glad to have a new, important friend. I thought to myself as I'll need an important friend when the story of the $1 million note and bet comes out. I want the reader to know that I plan to pay back all the shop owners who sold me things on credit.
If I win the bet for the old gentleman,
I thought,
I will have an important job. With an important job, I will have a big salary.
I plan to pay back everyone with my first year's salary. Chapter 6: The Dinner Party. There were 14 people at the dinner party. The Duke and Duchess of Shoreditch, and their daughter Lady Anne Grace Eleanor de Bowen, Earl and Countess of Newgate, Viscount Cheapside, Lord and Lady Blatherskite, the ambassador and his wife and daughter, and some other people. There was also a beautiful 22-year-old English girl named Portia Langham. I fell in love with her in 2 minutes, and she with me. After a while, the house servant presented another guest, Mr. Lloyd Hastings. When Mr. Hastings saw me, he said,
I think I know you.
Yes, you probably do.
Are you the?
Yes, I'm the strange millionaire with the $1 million note in his pocket.
Well, this is a surprise. I never thought you were the same Henry Adams from San Francisco. 6 months ago, you were working in the offices of Blake Hopkins in San Francisco. I remember clearly. You had a very small salary. And, at night, you helped me arrange the papers for the Gould and Curry Mining Company. Now you're a millionaire, a celebrity here in London. I can't believe it. How exciting.
I can't believe it either, Lloyd.
Just 3 months ago, we went to the Miners' Restaurant.
No, it was the What Cheer restaurant.
Right, it was the What Cheer. We went there at 2 o'clock in the morning. We had steak and coffee. That night we worked for 6 long hours on the Gould and Curry Mining Company papers. Do you remember, Henry, I asked you to come to London with me. I wanted you to help me sell the Gould and Curry gold mine shares. But you refused.
Of course I remember. I didn't want to leave my job in San Francisco. And I still think it's difficult to sell shares of a California gold mine here in London.
You were right, Henry. You were so right. It is impossible to sell these shares here in London. My plan failed and I spent all my money. I don't want to talk about it.
But you must talk about it. When we leave the dinner party, you must tell me what happened.
Oh, can I? I really need to talk to a friend.
Lloyd said, with water in his eyes.
Yes, I want to hear the whole story, every word of it.
Thank you, Henry. You're a true friend.
At this point, it was time for dinner. Thanks to the English system of precedence, there was no dinner. The Duke of Shoreditch wanted to sit at the head of the table. The American ambassador also wanted to sit at the head of the table. It was impossible for them to decide, so we had no dinner. The English know about the system of precedence. They have dinner before going out to dinner. But strangers know nothing about it. They remain hungry all evening. Instead, we had a dish of sardines and a strawberry. Now it was time for everyone to play a game called cribbage. The English never play a game for fun. They play to win or to lose something. Miss Langham and I played the game, but with little interest. I looked at her beautiful face and said,
Miss Langham, I love you.
Mr. Adams,
she said softly and smiled.
I love you too.
This was a wonderful evening. Miss Langham and I were very happy. We smiled, laughed, and talked. I was honest with her. I told her that I was poor and that I didn't have a cent in the world. I explained that the $1 million note was not mine. She was very curious to know more. I told her the whole story from the start. She laughed and laughed. She thought the story was very funny. I didn't understand why it was funny. I also explained that I needed an important job with a big salary to pay all my debts.
Portia, dear, can you come with me on the day I must meet those two gentlemen?
Well, yes, if I can help you.
She replied.
Of course you can help me. You are so lovely that when the two gentlemen see you, I can ask for any job and any salary. With you there, my sweet Portia, the two gentlemen won't refuse me anything.
Chapter 7, A $1 Million Idea. At the end of the dinner party, I returned to the hotel with Hastings. He talked about his problems, but I didn't listen to him. I was thinking about Portia the whole time. When we arrived at the hotel, Hastings said,
Let me just stand here and look at this marvelous hotel. It's a palace. What expensive furniture. You have everything you want. You are rich, Henry. And I am poor.
His words scared me. I too was poor. I didn't have a cent in the world, and I had debts to pay. I needed to win the gentleman's bet. This was my last hope. Hastings didn't know the truth.
Henry, just a tiny part of your income can save me. I'm desperate.
Hastings cried.
My dear Hastings, sit down here and drink this hot whiskey. Now tell me your whole story, every word of it.
Do you want to hear my story again?
But you never told me your story.
Of course I told you my story as we walked to the hotel. Don't you remember?
I didn't hear one word of it.
Henry, Are you ill? Is something wrong with you? What did you drink at the dinner party?
Oh, Hastings, I'm in love. I can only think about my sweet Portia. This is why I didn't hear your story before.
Hastings got up from his chair, shook my hand, and laughed.
I'm very happy for you, Henry, very happy.
He said, smiling.
I'll tell you the whole story again.
So he sat down and patiently started to tell me his story. To make a long story short, the owners of the Gould and Curry gold mine sent Lloyd to England to sell the shares of the mine for $1 million. Any money he received over $1 million was his to keep. Hastings's dream was to sell the shares for more than $1 million and become rich. He had only 1 month to sell the shares. He had done everything to sell them, but nobody wanted to buy them. Then he jumped up and cried,
Henry, you can help me. Will you do it?
Tell me how.
Give me $1 million and I'll sell you all the shares. You will be the new owner of the gold mine. Don't refuse.
I did not know what to say. I wanted to tell Hastings the truth. But then an intelligent idea came to me. I thought about it for a moment and then calmly said,
I will save you, Lloyd.
Then I am already saved. How can I thank you?
Let me finish, Lloyd. I will save you, but not in that way. I have a better way. I know everything about that mine. I know its great value. You will sell the shares by using my name. You can send anyone to me, since people in London know me. I will guarantee the gold mine. In a week or two, you will sell the shares for $3 million by using my name. And we'll share the money you earn. Half to you and half to me.
Lloyd was very happy and excited. He danced around the room and laughed.
I can use your name. Your name, think of it. The rich Londoners will run to buy these shares. I'm saved. And I'll never forget you, Henry.
Chapter 8. Back to Portland Place. The next day, all of London talked about the shares of the California gold mine. I stayed in my hotel and said to everyone who came to me,
Yes, I know Mr. Hastings. He's a very honest man. And I know the gold mine, because I lived in the California gold country. It is a mine of great value.
People were now interested in buying the shares. I spent every evening with Portia at the American ambassador's house. I didn't tell her about the shares and the mine. It was a surprise. We talked about our love and our future together. Finally, the end of the month arrived. Lots of rich Londoners bought the shares of the mine. I had $1 million of my own in the London and County Bank. And Lloyd did too. It was time to meet with the 2 old gentlemen. I dressed in my best clothes and I went to get Portia. Before going to Portland Place, Portia and I talked about the job and the salary.
Portia, you are so beautiful. When the 2 gentlemen meet you, they will give me any job and any salary I ask for.
Henry, please remember that if we ask for too much, we will get nothing. Then what will happen to us?
Don't be afraid, Portia.
When we arrived, the same servant opened the door. There were the 2 old gentlemen having tea. They were surprised to see Portia. I introduced her to them. Then I said,
Gentlemen, I am ready to report to you.
We are pleased to hear this.
said one gentleman.
Now we can decide the bet that my brother Abel and I made. If you won for me, you can have any job in my power. Do you have the $1 million note?
Here it is, sir.
And I gave it to him.
I won.
He shouted.
Now what do you say, Abel?
I say he survived, and I lost $20,000. I can't believe it.
I have more to tell you,
I said.
but it's a long story. I'll tell you another time. For now, look at this.
What? A certificate of deposit for $200,000. Is it yours?
It's mine. I earned it by using the banknote you lent me for a month.
This is astonishing. I can't believe it.
Portia looked at me with surprise and said,
Henry, is that really your money? You didn't tell me the truth.
No, I didn't. But I know you'll forgive me.
Don't be so sure. You told me a lie, Henry.
Dearest Portia, it was only for fun. Come, let's go now.
But wait.
my gentleman said.
I want to give you the job and the salary you choose.
Thank you with all my heart. But I don't want the job.
Henry, you didn't thank the good gentleman in the right way. Can I do it for you?
Portia said.
Of course you can, my dear.
Portia walked to my gentleman, sat on his lap and kissed him on the mouth. Then the two old gentlemen shouted and laughed. I was amazed. What was happening?
Papa,
said Portia.
Henry doesn't want your job. I feel very hurt.
Darling, is that your father?
I asked.
Yes, he's my stepfather, a dear man. Now do you understand why I laughed when you told me your story?
My dearest sir,
I said.
I want to take back what I said. There is a job that I want.
Tell me.
I want the job of son-in-law.
Well. But you were never a son-in-law before. Do you know how to do this job?
Try me, please. Try me for 30 or 40 years, and if...
Oh, all right. Take her.
We're Portia and I happy. There aren't enough words in the dictionary to describe our happiness. When the Londoners heard the whole story of my adventures with the banknote, they talked of nothing else. Portia's father took the banknote back to the Bank of England and cashed it. Then he gave us the cancelled banknote as a wedding present. We put it in a picture frame and hung it on the wall in our new home. And so I always say,
Yes, it's $1 million banknote, but it only bought one thing in its life. The most valuable thing in the world, Portia.